If you wanted to design the absolute perfect human society from scratch, just a blank slate, you would probably just look at the blueprints for Finland. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, you really would. It's basically what every policy think tank uses as the gold standard.
Right. For decades, they've been held up as this utopia. They've practically eradicated poverty. Their education system is legendary. They routinely rank as the happiest people on Earth.
Year after year after year.
Year after year. And according to the United Nations Traditional Human Development Index, the HDI, they're sitting comfortably in the stratosphere, ranked 12th globally out of, nearly 200 countries?
Exactly. It really is the model we're all constantly told to emulate. Every developmental economist, they all point to the Nordic model, and Finland in particular as the finish line of human progress.
But, and this is a massive but, what if I told you that according to the UN's newest, most controversial data, the exact systems that make Finland a utopia are the very same systems that are heavily burdening the planet?
It's a huge paradox.
It is. Because when you take that shiny, pristine ranking of number 12 and you force the ledger to actually account for the environmental cost of that utopia, Finland's rank doesn't just dip.
No, it completely crashes.
It experiences a precipitous, cliff-like drop. I want you to picture a stark white background. In the center, a massive red arrow pointing straight down, overlaid with the number -22. Surrounding it are silhouettes of towering modern buildings just clashing with dense forest. It falls 22 places.
And 33rd globally. It is a staggering correction. And it represents perhaps one of the most important developmental mysteries of our time.
It really does. So welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is to analyze a massive stack of United Nations data covering 33 years, from 1990 all the way to 2023.
Right, a massive time frame.
Yeah, we are comparing that traditional Human Development Index, the HDI, against a relatively new and honestly highly disruptive metric about the Planetary Pressures-adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
Which changes everything, really.
It changes the whole game. And the guiding question for you today is this. Why does one of the world's most successful, happiest nations suddenly look so incredibly unbalanced the moment we put it on the scale of global sustainability? Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the climb.
The climb is crucial, yeah. Because before we can understand the fall, we have to understand how Finland got so high up in the first place.
Exactly.
To do that, we need to look at what we might call the scoreboard of prosperity. The traditional Human Development Index doesn't just measure how rich a country is. Historically, economists just looked at GDP, gross domestic product.
Right, just looking at the money.
Exactly. But the UN realized decades ago that simply having money doesn't mean your citizens are actually living good lives. So the HDI combines three basic pillars: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
And it's measured on a scale from 0 to 1, right?
Right, where 1 is essentially a sci-fi utopia where everyone lives forever and knows everything.
Basically impossible.
Yeah, practically impossible. Now, if we look at the data from 1990 to 2023, Finland's growth in this traditional metric is undeniably spectacular.
So where did they start in 1990?
Back in 1990, right around the end of the Cold War, Finland already had a very high HDI score of 0.823. Over the next 3 decades, that number climbs steadily. It's this smooth, high-altitude ascent, reaching an incredibly impressive peak of 0.948 in 2023.
Wow. And to give you, the listener, a sense of scale, let's bring in the global average. In 1990, the world average HDI was 0.608.
Quite a bit lower.
Yeah, and by 2023, the world grew to 0.756, so both are growing, obviously. But if you were to plot this on a graph, like a dual-line chart, the geometry of those two lines looks completely different.
They do. The global curve has a much steeper slope over those 33 years. What you're seeing there is basically catch-up growth.
Catch-up growth.
Yeah. You have developing nations making massive, rapid strides in basic literacy, rolling out basic sanitation, administering vaccines. When you move a population from having no running water to having basic plumbing, your HDI score jumps dramatically. You move from the 0.6 range into the 0.7 range very quickly.
It's the difference between, learning to walk and trying to shave a tenth of a second off an Olympic sprint.
That's a great analogy. Finland's curve is that Olympic sprinter. It's much harder to improve your score when you're already near the very top. Going from 0.823 to almost 0.95 requires incredibly sophisticated, microscopic societal engineering.
Right. You aren't just curing preventable diseases anymore.
Exactly. You are managing chronic late-life care. You aren't just teaching kids to read. You are building postgraduate research sectors. It's expensive and it's slow.
But, and this is something I noticed when looking at the global graph right around 2020 and 2021, the steep climb of the world average just stops.
Yeah, it hits a wall.
There's a distinct dip. The line essentially stumbles backward. I mean, we've got a circle drawn right around it on our data sheet.
Yes, that slight but highly visible global dip is the statistical footprint of unprecedented global challenges, primarily the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
For the first time in decades, the global average HDI actually reversed course. We lost years of life expectancy globally, and school closures just devastated the education metrics in developing nations.
But here's the crazy part. If you look at Finland's line, during that exact same window, 2020 to 2021, the turbulence is barely a blip.
It's almost invisible.
Yeah. The line flattens for a microsecond and then just keeps going up. Why didn't they take the same hit the rest of the world took?
It really speaks to the immense resilience of their institutional safety nets. When a crisis hits, a highly developed welfare state acts like a massive shock absorber.
A shock absorber, yeah.
They had the digital infrastructure to transition to remote schooling almost overnight without losing instructional quality.
Yeah.
Their healthcare system had the surge capacity to handle the medical crisis without, completely abandoning standard preventative care. The system bent, but it didn't break.
And those safety nets are most obvious when we look at the first pillar of the HDI, the health dimension, specifically life expectancy at birth. Let's talk about living longer.
Always a good topic.
The UN data for 2023 puts the world average life expectancy at 73.4 years. Finland sits at a staggering 81.9 years.
Which is incredible.
I want you to really think about the mechanics of that.
Right.
By simply being born within the borders of Finland, the system is essentially handing a citizen nearly an extra decade of life compared to the global average.
A decade of extra life is a profound developmental achievement, but it doesn't happen by accident. We have to look at how they achieve this.
Right, it's not magic.
No, not at all. It's not just about having high-tech hospitals to treat you when you're dying. It's about a cradle-to-grave philosophy of preventative care. They invest heavily in public health interventions, strict regulations on food and environmental toxins, and a culture that really promotes outdoor activity.
But if we drill down into the data, and I love this part, the gender gap within that life expectancy reveals something really fascinating. In Finland, women are living to an average of 84.7 years.
Almost 85.
Yeah, while men are living to 79.2. Now, let's contrast that with the world average, where women live to 75.9 and men to 71.0.
The biological and behavioral advantage for women in life expectancy is pretty much a global constant. Women generally outlive men everywhere due to a complex mix of genetics and lifestyle factors.
That's occupational hazards.
Exactly. Men traditionally have higher rates of occupational hazards, cardiovascular issues, things like that. But look at the baseline here. Finland has elevated the absolute baseline for both genders to the upper limits of modern medicine.
Wait, so Finnish men at 79.2 years are significantly outliving the global average for women, which is 75.9. Yep. That is wild.
It is wild. It proves that while you cannot eliminate the biological differences between genders, you can raise the floor so high that your most vulnerable demographic is still thriving way beyond the global norm.
Okay, so they have the time, they're living into their 80s. What are they doing with those years? That brings us to the bedrock of any society, education.
The second pillar.
And the data here honestly made me stop and reread the report to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding the metric. The UN measures this through a stat called expected years of schooling, or EYS.
Right.
The world average in 2023 is 13.00 years. That essentially means a kid goes to primary school, finishes high school, and maybe starts a year of vocational training or college. That makes sense. But Finland
is an outlier.
Finland is at 19.5 years. 19.5.
It is a truly remarkable number.
How is that even physically possible? 19.5 years of school implies a child entering the system is expected to go through preschool, primary, secondary, a 4-year university degree, and essentially sail right through to a master's degree. Is literally everyone in Finland walking around with a master's?
Not everyone, no. But the structural reality is that the Finnish system is designed with 0 dead ends.
0 dead ends.
Yeah. In many countries, if you choose a vocational path at age 16, you are locked out of the university track forever. In Finland, the system remains entirely porous. You can transition from a vocational trade school back into a polytechnic institute or a traditional research university at practically any point in your life.
Because it's free, right?
Exactly. Education is heavily subsidized or entirely free, and students receive living stipends. So the financial barrier to staying in school is effectively removed.
But I was tracking this expected years of schooling data year by year, and I noticed an anomaly that I really need you to explain. In 2013, there was this massive, sudden leap in the charts.
Ah, yes. The
Look-
2013 jump.
Yeah. For example, looking at the female expected years of schooling in Finland, it's hovering in the 17-year range in 2012. And then boom, in 2013 it jumps to over 20 years, 20.7 by 2023. Did they suddenly pass a law mandating everyone get a PhD?
That's a brilliant catch. When you see a jagged cliff face on a data chart like that in a highly developed nation, it rarely means a sudden biological or cultural shift. It points to a sweeping policy shift, or more often, a change in statistical methodology.
Meaning they just changed how they count the numbers.
Exactly. Around that time, Finland heavily revamped its integration of adult education, continuing education, and workforce retraining into its official core metrics.
Oh, I see.
This was a strategic response to the shifting global economy. Think of the post-Nokia era in Finland. They realized that in a modern, tech-driven economy, learning cannot stop at age 22.
Right, you have to keep adapting.
Exactly. They deepened their commitment to lifelong learning, funding programs for adults in their 30s, 40s, and 50s to return to school to upskill. The UN data simply adjusted to capture that new reality. It reflects a society that views education not as a hurdle to clear for employment, but as a continuous, structurally supported endeavor.
So we have this incredible baseline. The scoreboard of prosperity is blindingly bright. They live longer, they study forever, and their baseline HDI is practically touching the ceiling.
It really is.
But a high national average can easily hide a dark reality. You could have a society where all the wealth and education is hoarded by one demographic while everyone else is left behind. Does this utopian average actually hold up if we split the population in half?
That's the real test.
I want to look at how Finland bridges the gap, specifically through the Gender Development Index, the GDI.
This is a crucial pivot. The GDI essentially takes that HDI score we've been discussing and calculates it separately for women and for men, and then compares them. A score of exactly 1.00 means absolute perfect parity across health, knowledge, and living standards.
Okay, so where does the world stand?
In 2023, the world average points to what the UN classifies as medium equality, a GDI of 0.955. It shows that globally, women still lag behind men in these core developmental pillars.
And Finland.
Finland, however, sits at 0.992. If this were a dashboard in your car, the needle is pinned all the way into the green zone labeled extremely high equality.
But I dug into the historical data, and I found a crazy anomaly, a really surprising fact. You look back to the year 1996, and Finland's GDI wasn't just 1.00, it actually hit 1.008.
What's fascinating here is what a number over 1.00 implies in this specific UN methodology.
Right. How can you be more than perfectly equal?
Well, it means that, statistically speaking, women in Finland briefly outpaced men in those combined development metrics during that period.
Wait, so the women were actually doing better than the men overall?
Yes. It shows the fluidity of absolute parity. Equality is not a static finish line that you cross and then just sit down. It's a dynamic balance. Hitting 1.008 tells us that a system's safety nets and educational structures can be so effective that they actually reverse historical disadvantages, tipping the scale slightly the other way before settling back toward equilibrium.
Wow. To really visualize how they achieve this equilibrium, we have to look at another metric, the Gender Inequality Index, the GII. I don't want to talk about decimals here. I want you to imagine a municipal water filtration system.
Okay, I like this analogy.
And into the top of this system, you pour all the potential discrimination a person might face in a society, discrimination in reproductive health, in civic empowerment, in the labor market. A society with a high GII has a terrible filter, letting all those toxic inequalities pour right through the pipes and into the daily tap water of its citizens' lives.
A very grim picture.
Yeah. The world average GII is 0.455. A lot of toxicity is getting through. But Finland's GII is a staggeringly low 0.021. They rank 6th globally. Their filter catches almost everything.
It's remarkably efficient.
Since 1990, they have driven their GII down from 0.106 to 0.021. That is an 80% drop in systemic discrimination.
And if we want to know how they built such an effective filter, we have to look at who is doing the building. We look at empowerment and political representation.
Who's in the room where it happened?
Yeah. Precisely. If you want to know whose voices truly matter in a society, look at who makes the laws. The data shows that the global average for female representation in parliamentary seats is 26.5%.
Barely a quarter. So in most of the world, when laws are being drafted about healthcare, education, or labor, 75% of the people in the room are men.
Correct. Now look at Finland's parliament in 2023. 46.0% of the seats are held by women.
Nearly half the room.
Nearly half. And that's a steady, intentional climb from 33.5% back in 1990.
And I want to stress to you listening, this is not just some arbitrary diversity quota to make the UN charts look pretty. When nearly half your lawmakers are women, it fundamentally alters the actual fabric of national decision-making. It changes what gets debated on the floor. It changes what programs get funded.
Which leads directly into the most profound metric in this gender data, reproductive health. The policies drafted by that heavily integrated parliament yield tangible life and death results.
This is where the numbers get really intense.
They do. Let's look at the maternal mortality ratio, the number of women who die per 100,000 live births. The global average is 216.1. Finland's ratio is 8.3.
I just want to repeat that so it sinks in. The world loses 216 mothers for every 100,000 births. Finland loses 8.
It is a chasm. And we pair that with the adolescent birth rate. Globally, there are 39.1 births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 19. In Finland, that number is 3.1.
Okay, I have to stop you there. Because these are the kinds of numbers that just sound like magic. How does a country practically eliminate maternal mortality and teen pregnancy? What is the actual mechanism? Because it can't just be, they have nice doctors.
No, it's a combination of deep structural policies. First, you have the Finnish Neuvola system, the maternity and child health clinics.
Neuvola.
Yes. This is a system that dates back to the 1920s. It provides universal, free, highly standardized care to pregnant women and children. It's deeply embedded in the culture. Essentially, 100% of pregnant women use it. It builds immense trust between citizens and the healthcare system.
Wow.
Second, you have comprehensive, scientifically driven, unstigmatized sex education in schools. Third, you have accessible contraception and strong bodily autonomy laws.
So it's not just a reflection of good hospitals or access to antibiotics. It represents a society that fiercely protects every single life while simultaneously ensuring that young people have agency over their own futures rather than having their futures derailed by an unplanned pregnancy.
Exactly. When 46% of your parliament understands the biological and economic reality of childbirth, you get policies that treat maternal health as a non-negotiable pillar of national security.
It's incredible. So we've established that Finland doesn't just have high development. They distribute it incredibly fairly between genders. But what about society broadly? What about the gap between the rich and the poor?
The broader economic gap, yeah.
Because you can have gender equality, but if the top 1% of men and the top 1% of women are hoarding all the wealth, it's still a failing society. This brings us to what we'll call the resilience test. We are going to introduce the inequality-adjusted HDI, or the IHDI.
The IHDI is the ultimate reality check for any nation. It takes that standard HDI score and applies a mathematical penalty based on the level of inequality in a country.
Okay, so how does the penalty work?
Think of inequality as friction in an engine. A society might have a huge engine, massive GDP, great universities, but if inequality is high, that friction burns off a huge amount of horsepower before it ever reaches the wheels.
I love that.
If a society is perfectly equal, there is zero friction. The HDI and the IHDI are the exact same number, but no society on Earth is perfectly equal.
So let's look at the horsepower lost to friction. When you run the world average through this inequality adjustment, the global HDI suffers a massive, devastating 22.0% loss.
Over a fifth.
Think about that. More than a fifth of human potential globally is just lost. It's burned up by the friction of unfair distribution. But Finland's HDI only loses 6.0%, landing at an incredibly strong IHDI of 0.891.
A 6% loss versus a 22% loss. That differential proves that Finland has built immense social resilience. Inequality acts like a massive anchor dragging down global human development. But Finland has mostly severed that chain.
So the benefits are actually reaching everyone.
Exactly. It means that the high life expectancy, the 19.5 years of education, and the strong income aren't just the privilege of a few urban elites living in Helsinki. They are genuinely experienced by the vast majority of the population, whether you live in the capital or a rural town in Lapland.
But I am a naturally skeptical person. Even in a utopia, something is unequal. Where's that 6% penalty actually coming from? Let's break it down.
Let's look at the donut chart.
Yeah, the data splits this friction into 3 categories. The inequality in education accounts for a tiny 2.0% loss, practically nothing. The inequality in life expectancy causes only a 2.9% loss, so health and education are incredibly flat. But the income inequality loss, that sits at 12.8%.
It's significantly higher.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Even in Finland, Education is perfectly distributed. You go to school, I go to school, we all get 19 years of great education. But income. Why is the income penalty 6 times higher than the education penalty?
It raises an incredibly important point about the limits of social engineering.
Wow.
Even in a heavily unionized, highly taxed Nordic welfare state with massive social transfers, unemployment benefits, housing allowances, universal healthcare income disparity remains the hardest puzzle to solve.
It just won't go away.
No. It is the most stubborn source of developmental friction.
Why is it so stubborn?
Because you can mandate that every hospital provides identical care, and you can ensure every public school is world-class without charging tuition. You can legislate equal opportunity. But managing the free market's tendency to consolidate wealth is a persistent structural challenge.
Right, they aren't a closed system.
Exactly. Finland still operates within a globalized capitalist framework. They have tech billionaires, they have multinational corporations. Even for the architects of the Finnish model, entirely flattening income without stifling economic innovation is a needle they are still trying to thread.
Okay, so up to this point, if you are listening to this, you're probably thinking, Finland is the greatest place on earth. I should pack my bags, move there, or at the very least, we should copy their laws and do exactly what they do.
It's a very common reaction to this data.
They are healthy, highly educated, gender equal, and incredibly resilient to inequality. The scoreboard is glowing, the engine has very little friction, but we promised you a paradox at the beginning of this deep dive. We promised you a cliff.
Yes. This is the turning point of our analysis. We have firmly established the utopia. We've explained the mechanisms of their success. Now, we must introduce the environmental cost, which completely upends the traditional perspective of what it means to be developed.
The moment of truth.
We have to look at the Planetary Pressures-adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
The PHDI. This is where the UN essentially takes that beautiful HDI score, looks at the utopia you built, and hands you the bill for the natural resources it took to build it.
They ask for the receipts.
And when the natural resource usage is billed to the ledger, Finland's score drops by 21.1%, plummeting down to 0.748. Meanwhile, the world average, which we established is much lower to begin with, only drops by 10.1% to 0.680.
The gap between their human development and their planetary pressure is massive.
Wait, hold on. I have to push back on this. This makes no intuitive sense. Finland is famous for being green. They have pristine forests, thousands of lakes, electric vehicles everywhere. Why is the green, progressive Nordic country being penalized twice as harshly as the global average?
Because high human development, as it is currently engineered in the 21st century, requires an astonishing, almost incomprehensible amount of physical matter and energy. Let's look at the carbon footprint first.
No.
In 2023, Finland's per capita CO2 emission is 5.70 tons. The world average is 4.54 tons.
Okay, stop right there. The average Finn is emitting a full ton more than the global average. How can anyone call them a green utopia when they are polluting more than the average human on Earth?
Well, we have to look at the historical trajectory to understand the nuance here. Finland is actually aggressively decarbonizing. If you look at the data from 2003, they peaked at a massive 13.9 tons of CO2 per capita.
Oh, wow. Almost 14 tons.
Yeah. Driving emissions down from 13.9 tons to 5.7 tons over 2 decades is a monumental policy success. They are rapidly transitioning to nuclear, wind, and biomass energy.
Okay, I hear you. They are improving. But a success. The atmosphere doesn't care about the trajectory of a line graph, right? It only cares about the absolute volume of carbon being dumped into it.
Yeah.
And right now, today, a Finnish citizen's existence puts a heavier burden on the climate than the average global citizen.
That is absolutely correct, and it highlights the hypocrisy of traditional development metrics. But carbon is only part of the story, and honestly, it's the part Finland is fixing the fastest.
Wait, so there's something worse?
Yeah. The real culprit, the impossibly heavy anchor that causes that 21.1% drop in their PHDI score, is something called the material footprint.
The material footprint. I want you, the listener, to really visualize this because the data here blew my mind. The material footprint measures the total amount of raw materials extracted globally to meet the final consumption demands of a country.
Everything they consume.
The world consumes, on average, 12.71 tons of material per person per year. Finland consumes a staggering 31.37 tons per person. That is 2.47 times the global average.
It is a phenomenal amount of mass.
I tried to figure out what 31 tons actually looks like. Imagine those massive, heavy wooden pallets you see in warehouses. Picture 31 of those pallets. Stack them high with extracted metallic ores, lithium, fossil fuels, construction sand, and raw biomass like timber and crops.
A mountain of earth, basically.
Picture 31 of those massive heavy pallets stacked up in your driveway. Now realize that is the pile of earth extracted for every single person in Finland every single year. That is the physical weight of their utopia.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the core reason for the PHDI plunge. High development requires immense physical resources. Think about what makes Finland great.
The education, the healthcare.
Right. Almost 20 years of continuous state-of-the-art education, world-class, hyper-modern hospitals, a vast heated infrastructure grid in a subarctic climate, high-speed transit, global digital connectivity. None of that is made of magic. It is made of matter.
So a society with that level of income and infrastructure requires a relentless, greedy intake of global materials.
Exactly. You cannot build and maintain a massive, high-functioning welfare state without extracting heavily from the earth. The data forces us to confront a very uncomfortable geopolitical reality.
Which is?
Finland's human flourishing is currently subsidized by massive material extraction, much of which happens outside its own borders. That pristine street in Helsinki is connected by an invisible umbilical cord to a lithium mine in another hemisphere or a cleared forest somewhere else.
And this brings us to the great reshuffling. This is where we bring all this data together to answer that guiding question we posed at the very beginning of the deep dive. We have to look at the global rankings once the environmental bill is paid.
Let's recap the vital stats. In the traditional Human Development Index, Finland sits proudly at rank 12 out of 193 countries.
A stunning achievement.
But under the PHDI, when we subtract the environmental damage they cause, the carbon, and more importantly, those 31 tons of material, they slide rapidly down the board to 33rd place, a differential of minus 22 places.
That is the giant red downward arrow we talked about at the start. So what does this all mean? When the dust settles on 33 years of UN data, what is the actual takeaway?
It means that a lack of environmental responsibility or an over-reliance on material extraction shakes the very foundation of what makes a country highly developed. The traditional metrics, the ones we've used for decades to celebrate nations like Finland, are essentially flawed.
Because they ignore the cost.
Exactly. They have been rewarding countries for borrowing heavily against the Earth's future. The negative 22 drop shows us that a significant portion of Finland's prosperity is, from a planetary perspective, an environmental debt.
Let's summarize the absolute truth of these data sets. Truth number one, Finland is the undisputed frontrunner in health, education, and gender equality. Through systems like lifelong learning and the Nuvola clinics, they have practically solved complex social issues that plague the rest of the world.
Undeniably.
Truth number two, they boast extreme social resilience. With a mere 6% inequality loss, the benefits of that society are shared, not hoarded. But truth number three is the bitter pill.
The environmental costs.
Their core vulnerability is a resource consumption rate that far, far exceeds sustainable boundaries.
It is an imbalance that cannot last forever.
Picture a physical scale in your mind. On one side, you have a towering, beautiful stack of books representing 19.5 years of education, a glowing heart representing 81.9 years of life, and the scales of justice representing near-perfect gender parity.
A beautiful picture.
On the other side, you have an incredibly heavy, dense, dark block of 31 tons of extracted earth per person. The scale is tipping dangerously.
It is entirely unbalanced, and that brings up the most crucial question we have to ask ourselves as a global society analyzing this data.
Exactly. And that is what I want to leave you with today. I want you to think about your own life. Look at your local infrastructure, the roads you drive on, the schools your kids attend, the energy it takes to heat your home in the winter.
It all has a cost.
Every piece of human development around you has a material weight. You could even look up your own country's ledger on the UN website to see your own PHDI drop.
Because here is the final provocative thought we need to consider. If the absolute pinnacle of human development, the countries like Finland that we are all desperately trying to emulate, can only achieve that elevated status by massively overdrawing their environmental account, then perhaps the developing world shouldn't be trying to catch up to Finland at all.
Wow, that flips the whole narrative.
It does. Because what if the true pioneer of the 21st century won't be the nation that maximizes human development through endless extraction? What if the true winner is the first nation that figures out how to completely decouple human flourishing from material destruction?
Think about that. If you want to design the perfect society, You can't just look at Finland anymore. Until we figure out how to build the hospitals, educate the public, and care for our citizens without stacking up 31 pallets of extracted earth for every single person, even our best, most beautiful utopias are just borrowing time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.